Okay, so this is the topic that I was given. Legal and regulatory hurdles for Kenyan-wide charging infrastructure. But e-mobility, when we're talking about a regulatory framework or a policy framework, is so much broader than that. And that's why I decided to put a subtopic there that is called Global Experiences in E-Mobility Regulation. What's a way forward for Kenya? And as we've heard the PS emphasize, we are actually here to discuss and look for a way forward, even if not today, to at least begin the conversation so that we can find a way forward. All right, so when we talk about e-mobility, what are we talking about? In a simplest way possible, it's a term used to refer to the electrification of transport and the use of electric vehicles. And as I've had most of the discussion, you'd see that most of us think of, yes, electric buses, we think of electric vehicles, we think of electric trains, those are the most common. But this can be much, much broader. As we've heard, we can have two-wheelers, we can have three-wheelers, we can have electric bicycles, we can have electric scooters. I think these are quite common in the UK. We can actually have electric helicopters as well. However, I think the ones that are in testing right now are unmanned, right? We can also have electric ships. Yeah, we can have also electric tankers, but this, of course, is moving forward. What is more common is, like we said, electric trains, electric buses, electric bikes, scooters, and motorcycles as well. So why am I talking about this? Because like I said, a regulatory framework is supposed to be really forward-looking, not just what we have now, talking about electric vehicles. It should be looking way far ahead. And if you look at the developed countries, they actually have policies that cover these kinds of crafts, okay? So that when you have a ship or electric boat and it comes in charges dockside, you have a policy, you have a regulatory framework, you have regulations that govern all that, yeah? The charging infrastructure. What is the costing for the power that you're actually going to draw as you charge your vehicle? So these are some of the things that we're going to touch on. I'm going to touch on in my presentation. So statistics are very important. As we've heard all the presenters saying, electric vehicles are actually the way to go, or electric trains are the way to go. And why is that? Particularly in Africa and Kenya. We have the statistics there that in Africa, urbanization is growing at an average rate of 4% per year, whereas a global average is 2%. So we have a lot of people coming into the urban centers, and what do we have with that? We have congestion, we have pressure on infrastructure, we have more vehicles, we have more pollution. So it's quite critical for Africa and for Kenya to be thinking about electric vehicles. One other statistic to note is that the electric vehicle market is growing exponentially. And we'll possibly hear what the gentleman from Tesla has to say to us about that. I know that they are at the forefront of that. And we have some statistics that show that about 3 million units of electric vehicles are being sold globally, possibly even more than that. Yeah? When we look at the projections, by 2040, about 54% of new global car sales will be electric vehicles. So we cannot ignore e-mobility. We cannot ignore the electric vehicle space. We can't ignore that. By 2040, we are also saying that 33% of the world's car fleet will be electric vehicles. So this is the way we're going, and we just have to step up and put in a regulatory framework in place. Unfortunately, what normally happens is that the law or policy is usually like a last born. And what this means is that you find that innovation takes place and then we step into regulate. I think that's also what's happening with, like, say, digital lending apps, isn't it? They've been around for a while, but you can see now is when the conversation is being had that we need to actually have regulations and put in policies. So it's not too late for us. I think that we've started having this discussion at a good time when we can set policies in place. All right. So when we talk about a policy and regulatory framework, we have to first establish what exactly is an electric vehicle. And I've focused more on electric vehicle because this is the most predominant form of e-mobility transport that we are moving towards, or that is currently in use, aside from electric trains. And just drawing from other countries that are more advanced, have a more advanced regulatory and policy framework, We have in the European Union, Article 2.2 of the Directive 2014-94 EU, which gives actually it was a very complex definition. I said I won't put it there. But if we break it down further, we look at the UK, and they have a definition of what an electric vehicle is. So we might be thinking it's maybe the hybrid. I remember some years back, the Prius was quite common, I think, a little on the Kenyan roads, and that was a hybrid. But electric vehicles can actually be more than that. You can have an all-electric vehicle, which has battery as the only power source. So you must charge this vehicle. You go to a charging port, a charging station, and you charge the vehicle. You can also have plug-in hybrids. And what does that mean? You have a vehicle that has a battery that may be charged, and also a small capacity fuel engine, yeah, so that you can switch between the two. And this is just borrowed from what the UK has. Huh? You can also have hybrids, where you have, again, a battery, a car with a battery, and a small capacity fossil fuel engine, and that battery is actually charged by its own engine. Okay? You can also have a fuel cell vehicle, where you have a non-fuel fossil fuel system, which is used to charge a battery in a vehicle. You can also have fuel cell vehicles, which are powered by a non-fuel system and or recharge battery, and these are refueled with gaseous hydrogen. So we have so many engineers in the room, and they can tell us a lot more about this. But why it's important to understand some of these things is because regulations and policy don't take place in a vacuum. You first must understand the context, whatever your area of specialization is, whether you're a lawyer, you're an environmentalist, you're an economist, you must understand at least part of the context so that you can be able to advise in your particular area. So when we talk about the regulatory framework, so what would normally happen is that a country would develop a policy. This is a general framework. And then from that policy, you then have a law, an act of parliament in Kenya that is developed, and then you have regulations that then operationalize that act, yeah, for implementation. So what I'll cover under this section are just the general, in a general way, what you would expect to find in that policy framework or an act that is actually dealing with e-mobility or electric vehicles. So we have issues of charging station. What is a charging station? You need to define what a charging station is. It has to be clearly defined. Does a policy require that charging stations be located in a particular place? Who is going to own the charging station? Is it going to be something that is driven by government? Is it going to be open to private sector? What are the charging rates? When you go and charge your vehicle, what are the rates you're going to pay for that electricity that you're actually charging your vehicle with? Yeah, when we talk about an alternative fuel infrastructure, I've just mentioned prior that we have vehicles that can be fueled with hydrogen gas. So you need an infrastructure for that. How do you house the gas? Okay, how do you store it? So you need to talk about the infrastructure you require for that. We need to talk about licensing. Who is going to do the licensing of this? Charging station operators. Okay? Are you going to have a separate regulator actually? Because as you can see, e-mobility cuts across so many sectors, but you'll find that in most countries, it's the Ministry of Transport or Department of Transport that takes the lead on matters policy. We've also had a discussion about tax incentives. That policy would ideally cover also what incentives are going to be given to those who are manufacturing electric vehicles, those who are importing them, possibly those who are assembling them. We have an assembly plant in Kenya, I believe, yes, for VW. So what is the tax structure going to be? To incentivize, like we said, to encourage that. We're also going to look at, in a policy framework, how you adapt the existing infrastructure. So if we're saying we're going to introduce electric buses, or we're going to have sharing of vehicles, are we saying that we're going to then designate, one lane on the roads for that? How are we going to adapt the already existing infrastructure to accommodate this kind of vehicles? All right, when we talk about a policy and regulatory framework, we can't ignore that now we are operating in a different environment than we were before. we have a national government and county government. And the county government has been given a mandate under the constitution to undertake energy reticulation, or electricity reticulation. What does that mean? It means actually undertaking connectivity initiatives within the counties. But as you can see, where we are going, the scope is so much broader now. County governments need to get really much more involved. We've heard the peers talking about COSAP, Kenya Off-Grid Solar Access Project. And this project seeks to create mini-grids or build mini-grids, mini-grids in far-flung areas in this country where the grid has not yet arrived there. So county governments need to be involved in this conversation, because whereas we may say that Nairobi is the main urban area, we can see that a lot of growth is also taking place in the counties. So policy, we need to look at what is the role of the national government, what will be the role of the county governments. We also need to talk about funding incentives. And what kind of funding incentives are we saying? Funding, could we have a fund maybe to fund research and development activities, for instance, or to fund also those entrepreneurs who are coming up with nice innovative ideas, say electric bicycles, something like that. Yeah, Kenyans can be quite innovative. I think you've seen that. People who've built crafts that can actually hover at least a little bit, or building cars from literally nothing, yeah? All right, so I mentioned about a regulator. We need to be clear who is going to be regulating this sector, yeah? Because like you can see, it's so multifaceted. This environmental component, talking about reducing carbon emissions. We're talking again about energy, renewable energy. You need energy experts there. We're talking about funding as well, tax incentives. So you can see it involves the National Treasury, yeah, or Ministry of Finance, depending on the country that you're talking about. Policy framework also must take into account reporting. Because it's no good to have policies, regulations. We are not reporting. Periodically, we should have reports. Is it working? Is it not? What needs to change? And that should be captured in a policy and regulatory framework. So there's also a point there, existing fossil fuel options. So what does that mean? What I'm saying here, or what we're saying here, is that we can't ignore that the use of fossil fuels will be around for a while. And if you look at how other countries are doing it, China, India, they are setting target dates by which they hope to have a certain you have certain dates or years by which we expect to have a certain percentage of vehicles on the road being electric vehicles. All right, so if we look at what other regions in the world are doing, we can look at sample regulatory policies and laws. If you look at the European Union, they have a framework for decarbonizing light transport. So what are we saying? Reducing carbon emissions. Okay, so that means manufacturing vehicles that actually produce lower carbon emissions. There's a renewable energy directive requiring that a certain percentage of energy generated is from renewable energy sources, your solar, your wind, biogas and biomass and the like. You also have an alternative infrastructure directive that gives guidance or general guidance on what members of the EU should do towards, again, having alternative infrastructure that can accommodate the requirements of e-vehicles. We look at the UK. Sorry, I think there's a bit of duplication there, but the UK also does have its own laws, yeah? Particular acts, actually, that deal with electric mobility. So when we bring it closer home, looking at the African continent, South Africa, we don't really have, we have plans. These countries have plans. Like South Africa has a green transport strategy, which seeks to encourage the use of electric vehicles. And they have put things in there like a requirement for retrofitting of certain vehicles to accommodate the electric aspect. Yeah, but I couldn't quite get a policy. There's somebody who's seen that. I did quite some research and I really didn't get a policy. Rwanda has a national e-mobility plan. And at the forefront of this plan is looking at electric motorbikes. Yeah, so Rwanda is doing a pretty good job. In fact, I've seen that the World Bank is looking to fund a proof of concept in Rwanda where they're going to try electric buses, yeah, and see if that can be replicated. So that's something that that is quite commendable. So Kenya, what's a question, where are we? Where are we right now? And we've had a lot of things said here. We have electric cars, hybrid cars. We also have Nokia, and these are just examples. We have Nokia. This was a Finnish company that came in, and these are, I believe, 100% electric vehicles. And it's a taxi hailing app that they're using. And the first picture there is an initiative by Siemens Stiftung and Wetu, and where this was done in Kisumu, in the western part of the country, where they have developed an electric load bicycle, and they're actually also constructing charging stations, okay? So there's so many things that are going on in the country, but we don't have a particular e-mobility policy. The most we have, I can say right now, in regards e-mobility, are these standards that have been developed by the Kenya Bureau of Standards, and these were approved in June of 2018. There are actually about 17 or 18, and I've just put just a sample of 3 there, but like I said, about 18, and they mostly focus on electric vehicles. I didn't quite see standard that talked about, say, electric bicycles or electric motorcycles, but this is a start. At least having standards is something, but this conference has come at the right time, because when we're together in the same room, we can progress that conversation and see what to do. Challenges and opportunities. Why did I put it like this? Because I think when you have challenges, therein lies the opportunity, okay? So lack of an e-mobility policy and regulatory framework makes things a bit hazy. How do we operate? What's the right thing to do? Do we need approvals for that? It becomes very, very gray, but this is an opportunity for us to discuss, to learn from others who've developed policies and acts, and learn from their mistakes. There's so many learnings that we can get. Limited energy access. What's the energy penetration in Kenya at the moment? I think the target is to have 100% by 2022, I think, if I'm not wrong. And there's so many initiatives. We've had the Last Mile project that has been funded by the African Development Bank, the World Bank. Government of Kenya has also put in a component, a funding component to that. And we also have the Kenya Off-Grid Solar Access project as well. So there's much that's been done, but it's a challenge. It is a challenge. Poor infrastructure. Yeah, if we're talking about having accommodating vehicles on our roads good enough actually? Maybe a certain number of roads can accommodate an extra lane, or a lane that is hived off or set apart purely for electric vehicles, but how many of them? But we have to start somewhere, and therein is an opportunity. We could try pilot projects on certain roads and see if that can work. A skill and knowledge gap among relevant professionals. How many of us actually really know, have that in-depth skilled knowledge in Kenya about e-mobility? I think now is when we're really having that conversation, and we really need to involve the engineers, the lawyers, the economists, the tax people, the finance people. Yeah, so like I said, there's an opportunity. Here we are discussing, here we are learning. So that's a challenge, but therein is also an opportunity. Public awareness. How many people know what e-mobility is? Really, how many of them? Yeah, maybe in the urban cities, urban areas. So there's still much that needs to be done so that we can share how important this is and the role that each and everyone has to play towards actually bringing a policy and regulatory framework into place. And I think I'm within my time. Thank you so much.